Welcome, busy gamers. Today we're going to talk about Inscryption. What's good, what's bad, and that all-important question we ask ourselves, is it worth your time? Before we move on though, if you're enjoying this content, you want to see more from me, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, as it is going to go a long way to helping me develop and improve. Also, for your convenience, I've broken this video into chapters, so if you've joined me for another worth your time video in the past, feel free to skip to the section you're most interested in. Now, Inscryption is a roguelike deck builder developed by Daniel Mullins Games and Devolver Digital. Inscryption sets itself apart in a crowded space by taking a less replayable and more story-focused path. The game centers around a dark and creepy mystery that unfolds as a card game vlogger finds a digital copy of Inscryption, a cancelled physical card game in which no such digital version is supposed to exist. During the game, you play as the vlogger's character as he interacts with several personalities. Some of them are unique, and some of them are just hiding behind a mask and pretending. Think of it like the most intense and very disturbing dungeon master you've ever had. The game is split into 3 specific acts, each with drastically different, yet familiar gameplay themes that carry throughout. In the first act, you're playing on a 2x4 grid of cards and sacrificing cute little forest creatures, or using the bones of dead creatures to play more. These creatures then attack or block, and damage dealt is added to the tipping scales. Once these scales are completely imbalanced, it'll cause the game to end. If they're imbalanced 5 on your side, you lose. If they're imbalanced 5 towards your opponent, you win. All of this occurs while also exploring a dark and creepy cabin with escape room style puzzles. In Act 2, you get a more classic RPG experience, in which you build your own deck completely from scratch and open packs of cards, all while traversing an overland map with the goal of taking the place of one of 4 specific scribes. Now, in Act 3, you're back in the cabin, so to speak, but everything has changed. I don't want to spoil too much, as this is heavily story related, but there are new cards, and it's now a 2x4 grid, as well as rooms and environments to explore that you haven't seen in the past. Now, that's it for the overview and the summary here. Let's get into the review proper. At the time of this review, I've played Inscryption for about 22 hours. I've completed the main story, and then I've completed some of the post-game challenging content in the form of Casey's mod, as well as also kind of gone back and played through a few of the acts again, just to hunt some achievements and things of that nature, because I really did enjoy this game. Based on this, I would expect most players are going to end up taking around 12 to 16 hours to complete the main story, assuming that they're not rushing and, well, that they avoid 1 or 2 specific strategies, such as the Ouroboros. So, what's good about Inscryption? I think first and foremost, we have to talk about the story. It took a horror theme and it ran with it, creating compelling and creepy tales without ever really leaning into tropes or relying on jump scares to set the stage and the mood. The first act, throughout the entire thing, I found myself genuinely curious and truly enjoying exploring both the cabin and how the game versus Leshy, which is your antagonist at that point, was really going. Into Act 2, a larger and more external plot started to take shape via some found footage that really made me want more. I really was hunting for and kind of jonesing for the next time I saw those little videos pop up on my screen. Act 3 brought everything to a satisfying and interesting conclusion. I was almost sad when some of it went away. I think the bosses really stood out as unique throughout the entire game, and even the finale threw in new experience just as it was saying goodbye. Even though the story was the main draw for me, the card play also very much shines in this game. I'm a card gamer. I do a lot of card games, LCGs, CCGs, deck builders in board gaming, and particularly in Act 1 and 3, where there's a ton of control and customization in creating your deck, but it's still done in slow and bite-sized chunks that don't force you to go all out and build an entire deck. That means it still remains very accessible for the player who isn't a card gamer, but it's deep enough for the gamer who is. Cards themselves also remain pretty simple. Their attack and defense values make up the majority of the game, and the symbols are very bold, clear, and often accompanied by additional graphical or visual cues. So, for example, when a card is altered to be flying, flying creatures create a card that hovers and kind of seem to flap their wings. So the roguelike elements of this game are also done very well, and they ensure everybody is moving through the story at a regular pace. The primary mechanic for these are secrets and exploration items done within the cabin, and it can do a variety of things from making your basic resources, which in the first act are squirrels. Those cards can improve, eventually becoming flying 1/1 bees, to obtaining cards that improve throughout the entire game, like the Ouroboros that I mentioned earlier. That's a lot of the goods, but it's important to also notice where a game has flaws. So let's talk a little bit about the bads, the downsides of this particular game. What are they? The theme. I know I said early on that the story was amazing, but the theme unfortunately is not going to be for everybody. While I myself also don't really like horror when it comes to a visual medium, I love well-told auditory horror. So podcasts like the Magnus Archives and things of that nature I'm really into. So I still really enjoyed the game, but some people won't be able to get past the fact that it is just in the creepy horror genre, and there are definitely very dark moments. Some of those I'll probably show on the screen, and none of them get overly grisly. I would say they might give young children a nightmare, but they never edged into the area where they were actually scary to what I would say the average adult would be consuming. There are also some odd gaming roadblocks built into the game. For example, early on in the game, it wants you to get a candle from somewhere else in the cabin. This is just a mechanic to show that you have additional lives, and it basically forces you to lose to justify you doing that. Also, if you do well on an early run, you get a red message during the bosses. It says, "Too far, too fast," and then your opponent immediately summons 2 full rows of grizzlies. While technically this is a winnable fight in a few niche situations, and I did actually manage to trigger a win in one of these, it is definitely not something you can control, and I felt like it was fairly lucky for me to get a win in that area. The intent is definitely to gate you behind several losses to pace out the story, and that can create for frustrating experiences. So Acts 2 and 3 are also, unfortunately, a bit slower. They taper off in engagement and enjoyment for me compared to Act 1. This is definitely not to say Act 2 and Act 3 are bad, as I felt the ending was 100% worth the journey. But in comparison to the first act, the pacing slows down noticeably. Act 2 loses the quick back-to-back card play, pathing, and things of that nature, opting for a more complete deck building mechanic. And the opponents, they just feel very easy compared to what you struggled with in the first act. So even though it might not actually take that long, it feels less satisfying to take down those bosses. Act 3 does return to the initial winning formula, and it has a few twists. There's a new resource mechanic for the cards, and I liked it. But because the map was stagnant instead of random like it was in Act 1, when resources were left at your point of death, it became a lot more repetitive than original. You would need to take the same path back to your body if you died, and you would play the same fights out. That did make it more of a puzzle and less of a tactical, so strategic versus tactical during Act 3. So it was still fun, but it does drag. So we've talked about the good, we've talked about the bad. Where is it when it comes to the channel's special sauce, so to speak? We're going to call this the Ephemeral Efficiencies. I'll think of a better name later, but how does Inscryption treat your personal time? I think the game has an excellent tutorial. It allows you to get right into the game with very little downtime, and because those things are added in small doses, you never feel as if you need to pause your gameplay to figure something out. The deck building is done from a very small deck size, and choices are made between at most 3 cards when adding to your deck, which means even if you're not a card gamer, you don't have to read a lot, it's easy to do, and it's never a focus of your time. Playing is the focus. Even in Act 2, where you do build your own decks, there is an Add Cards button. It builds the entire deck for you based on your current card pool. And I replayed the entire act using this feature solely, and I was able to clear the act with no issues, meaning I never added a single card to my own deck. I deleted the deck and I forced it to make the deck it wanted for me. It's still completely beatable in that scenario. Session length for the game is also never an issue. Most runs last about 20 to 40 minutes once you're familiar with the game, and if you don't have time to finish that 20 to 40 minute run, for example, it saves at your last fight. Decks are very small and the cards are relatively simple, so if you've had to do that, you can pick right back up where you left off by just scrolling up, looking at the 10 cards in your deck, I would say at most. And even if you've left it between days between your plays, you're fine. If you want to redo specific content once the game is completed, you can also jump back into any act as if it was fresh and reset it with a single button. So if you're not enjoying a run, you can reset that, drop in, drop out. You can also do anything you want for achievements or something if you choose without playing the entire game again. It's very accessible. Act 2, while it's lighter on the story and longer than it needs to be, as I said, Act 3 can feel like a grind. So if you're ever feeling like these things are an issue, make sure you go ahead and acquire the Ouroboros or the Orobot, as it can push you over the edge in those and kind of make it to where if you're feeling it's bogging down in the later acts, you can blaze through that, you can get through your story because you always have a card that will mechanically win a fight. And because I don't want to just name a card here, getting the Orobot in Act 3 is consistent and controllable. You can keep your deck thin by not taking additional cards. I'll make a quick and separate video explaining exactly how to get this, so if you're interested in that, I'll make sure to link it in the show notes below, but I don't want that to get buried in this as it's going to take 2 to 3 minutes to tell you. So at this point, I think we've talked enough about the game. Let's go ahead and give it our final scores. So overall, I'm going to give this game an 8. I strongly recommend it, and for its typically low price of $15 to $20, it is more than worth the purchase. The score would have been higher for me if the gameplay did not seem to drop off post Act 1. The Ephemeral Efficiency score, how respectful of its time is it for you? I'm going to say it's a 9. The game is very respectful of your time, and it's going to fit well into most schedules. It doesn't play quite fast enough for a perfect 10, but it's a very solid entry. So, I've now given you all my thoughts about Inscryption. If you liked this, if you've got feedback for me, leave a comment below and I'll make sure to reply as quickly as possible. I'll see you in the next video.